Hello, I wanted to talk a little bit about the brain and some brain functioning and how that relates to us psychologically. First of all, I'm going to talk about the cerebral cortex, which is this wrinkled outer layer of the brain. Um, we're also going to talk about the functions of the right and left hemispheres of the brain. We're going to talk about where language is generated from in the brain. We're going to talk about the different lobes of the brain and their functions. And then we're going to talk about how the brain is organized into forebrain structures, midbrain structures, and hindbrain structures. We're not going to talk about brain imaging techniques in this video. So the cerebral cortex is this wrinkled outer layer of the brain, and it's actually associated with our highest level of mental capabilities, thinking and learning. All sorts of important things occur in this cortex. And the more the wrinkles that the cortex have, the higher level the intelligence level of the animal or the person. The cortex is separated into 4 different lobes. The frontal lobe is the most sophisticated part of our brain, and of course it's in the front, so it makes it easier to remember, but it processes things like language and thinking, personality, impulse control here in the very front of the brain. But really a lot of our important mental capabilities that we think of in psychology. Behind that frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is really responsible for processing sensory information. The temporal lobes here are above our ears, and it's actually on both sides of our brain. The temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe both have left and right sides on either side of our brain. So the temporal lobe is right above our ears, and it actually processes our auditory information, so hearing and language. So it's a really important part of the brain there. This occipital lobe processes our visual information. So it takes information from our eyes and processes that information. It also stores visual information as well. So this is what a plastic model of our brain looks like. These 2 pictures at the bottom are actually real pictures of the brain. So these wrinkles and folds in here are called gyri, and they really allow the brain to communicate with different parts, and it increases our intelligence level. The sulci are these deep grooves that separate the lobes of the brain, and you can see in the plastic model it looks really clear. Here in the actual brain, it's not quite as clear. But you can see here that this here is the temporal lobe. This is the frontal lobe of the brain. I think this is the separation between the frontal lobe and that parietal lobe here. And then if you look back here, this is the occipital lobe. So the sulci are the deep grooves that separate the lobes of the brain, and the gyri are just those folds. And the thing that's interesting about these folds is just how much more intelligent it makes us. And we can look at an animal brain and see that they have much fewer folds and grooves. Their brains are much more smooth than ours. And then also, how is it that we have an elephant that has this huge brain and we have this kind of tiny little brain? You know, that intro image that I have in there actually shows the person holding the brain in their 2 hands. And they say our brain is really about the size of a grapefruit, and you can hold your brain in both your hands. So how is it that our brain is so much smarter than these animal brains that are huge? And what scientists have discovered is that it's not the size of the brain, it's the wrinkles, and that the size of the brain has to do with the size of the animal, not the intelligence level. So we have 2 different sides of the brain, 2 different hemispheres in the brain. We have a left and a right hemisphere, and they are connected by the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is made up of 200 million axons. It's kind of crazy. So you can even see all the little axons in here. And the corpus callosum allows the left hemisphere to communicate with the right hemisphere. The cerebrum contains both the left and right hemisphere. It's just a bigger part of our brain. It's just a fancy name to learn that. Regions of both hemispheres specialize in different activities, and both hemispheres are constantly communicating and collaborating, and the corpus callosum makes that possible. So the brain is organized with left and right sides of the brain. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So the brain does specialize, in different parts of the brain specialize in different activities, and that's called lateralization. So it's the tendency for the brain to use specific parts for specific tasks. It makes the brain more efficient and works better. So both sides of the brain are capable of right and left brain activities, but they specialize in those activities. The left hemisphere is generally the language center of the brain. Um, and one of the reasons we know different things about the brain is due to brain injuries. So accidental brain injuries, surgical removal of parts of the brain, strokes where people have had damage to certain parts of the brain. So when somebody has damage to the brain, we can look at, what difficulties are they having with functioning, and how does that relate to that part of the brain that was damaged. The brain does have a remarkable ability to adapt and use different parts of the brain when an area is damaged, and this is called neuroplasticity. So this is why when somebody has a brain injury, maybe they have a car accident or something, they can relearn to walk, they can relearn to talk, but what they have to do is train another part of the brain to perform those tasks that the part of the brain that was damaged in their accident. There are also patients where we do different surgeries for different reasons, and it helps us really understand what different parts of the brain actually do. So there's something called a split brain surgery, which sounds really scary, and I would imagine it really would be. And the reason why these surgeries are done is because a person is having seizures that are causing their extreme electrical activity that's jumping across from both sides and both hemispheres of the brain. And so what they do is they go in and they cut this corpus callosum, and so they have completely separated the two sides of the brain. So the person now has two brains. The left and right hemisphere can no longer communicate with each other. And you would think that this would cause some pretty severe deficits. And fortunately, it really only creates subtle deficits, which is kind of hard to even imagine. So this is pictures trying to show you what they're talking about. So a person with a split brain surgery, these two sides of the brain can't talk to each other anymore. They can't communicate with each other. So if you present something to the person in that far left side of their visual field, it's going to get processed in the right hemisphere. And that right hemisphere now can't send information to the left hemisphere, where the left hemisphere actually can produce sound and say that, hey, that's an apple. Now, most people with these split brain surgeries just compensate. Most of the time you see something in your visual field, you just turn over there, and then you can actually process that information in the correct hemisphere. But in these experiments that they're doing to try to understand what the deficits are, they put it so that the person can only see it with their right hemisphere, and then that information can't get to the left hemisphere. But when the person's just walking around day to day, actually seems pretty normal. This is a video of a patient that has had their corpus callosum severed, and they actually show you this experiment where they're working with them and trying to show what deficits they have. But it's pretty amazing. The guy seems to be doing just fine. So we want to talk about the left hemisphere and how it is dominant in language. So the left hemisphere controls language, and there's two different areas that we've been able to identify, mostly through stroke victims that are involved in language. And I put these pictures on here. They're a little, I don't know if I would say scary, but dramatic for sure. So these are our military members that are coming back with some pretty severe head injuries. This man is missing some of his right hemisphere, and this man is missing much of his left hemisphere. And it's amazing that they're still walking around and still able to do many activities, but they're going to have some deficits, obviously, because of those injuries. But it's possible to overcome some of these even really severe injuries. So we're going to talk about the two different areas that we've been able to identify due to strokes. The first one is called Broca's area, and it's right here in the frontal lobe, and it's actually pretty near the motor cortex that we haven't talked about, but the frontal lobe controls all of our motor movements as well. And so when a person has damage to this area of the brain, they have difficulty with motor movements, and they have difficulty forming language or saying words. So they understand what's being said to them. They can actually write down words to communicate, but they have difficulty actually producing language. Wernicke's area is kind of is on the temporal lobe, and it causes the person to have trouble understanding language. So this is where you hear language and process language, and they have really difficult time understanding language, recognizing words, saying words. It's probably a more difficult deficit than the Broca's area, but these are very common injuries actually when people have strokes. This is a really good video. This is just a 1-minute video that gives you an example of what it might be like to have aphasia. And this young woman was 19 years old, just sitting in her English class in college, and had a stroke. It's really rare for young people to have a stroke, and a stroke is actually where you have a blood clot in your brain, and it blocks the flow of blood to a certain part of the brain, and that part of the brain actually dies. And so she had damage to the Broca's area because it was right there in that part of the brain. And amazingly, she has really recovered. But you can see she can say a few words, but she can't. She has a really difficult time, and she's gone through a huge amount of speech therapy to try to relearn language. And she understands language. She's able to communicate. But she's not able to actually produce that language. There's a second video that's much longer that really goes into what it was like for her to have that stroke and how she's doing now. But that video is about 10 years old. She's doing remarkably better now. So it's amazing to think that you totally lose that ability, but she was able to regain that ability. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the lobes of the brain. So this is the frontal lobe of the brain, and it's responsible for all of our higher level cognitive functionings, reasoning, motor control, emotions, and language. So the very back of the brain here is actually is our motor cortex, and it actually controls all of our motor movements. The parietal lobe is right behind there, and it actually processes all of our sensory information, and it has what we call the somatosensory cortex here that actually processes that sensory information. It also has a lot to do with our visual and spatial ability and our mathematical ability. And then the occipital lobe here in the back has to do with our visual information, and then the temporal lobe has to do with hearing and language, memory, and emotion as well. So I wanted to show you this image because I think it's really interesting. So this is where the motor cortex of the brain is. So it's part of the frontal lobe. And then the somatosensory cortex that processes sensory information is right here on the parietal lobe. And if you actually took a slice of the brain, either the motor cortex or the somatosensory motor cortex, if you flip this around and put it right here, you would see that this part of the brain right here is the motor part of the brain, controls swallowing, chewing, salivation, your tongue, your jaw. So that's why that Broca's area is so important to language and producing language, because it controls all those muscles and for your mouth to produce those words. And the somatosensory cortex, so all the sensations that you might have from your taste, any of the sensations from your mouth, your tongue, your jaw, all that kind of stuff is right around here. And then as you move around the cortex, you see all these different parts of the body that are either controlled by this motor cortex or is processing sensory information from the different parts of our body. The somatosensory cortex processes information like touch, temperature, and pain as well, which is pretty important. So you guys probably remember Phineas Gage, and his accident really told us a lot about the frontal lobes of the brain. They often refer to his injury to the prefrontal cortex, and what they're saying is that it's very, very front of the frontal lobe. And it gave us the earliest information that we had about what that frontal lobe is responsible for, and that personality and impulse control are really important functions of that part of the brain. Albert Einstein, people have always been fascinated about why was he so intelligent. And he died in 1955, and as soon as he died, they actually cut his brain out, which seems kind of creepy to me. And his brain is preserved somewhere, and scientists have been trying to study it and trying to understand how was his brain different than our brain, and how was he able to be so intelligent, and hopefully maybe how the rest of us can be so intelligent. And they actually found that areas of his parietal lobe were much larger when they compared it to 35 other male brains. And so that was one of the things they thought. Either he had a larger parietal lobe to begin with. This is always kind of a question among scientists. Was the parietal lobe bigger to begin with, and that's why he was smarter? Or was it because he used this parietal lobe more often and created more connections, which made it larger? And I think the case is probably that he created more connections because he used that parietal lobe more. They also found that his corpus callosum was thicker than the average person, and that makes sense because he used both sides of his brain much more than most of us did. So interesting to know. And there's a couple videos here that you could watch about Einstein's brain if you're interested in that. These are all embedded in my PowerPoint that I put the link in at the top of these videos. So there's 3 different categories of brain structures. It's just the way they organize different brain structures. So there's the midbrain here in the very middle. The forebrain is this whole pink area here, and it's really the major portion of the brain that we're interested in psychology. But the midbrain is also interesting, and it's this little blue area here. And then the purple area here is called the hindbrain, which is often referred to as like the reptilian brain. It controls our basic functions like breathing. This is the cerebellum here that controls our motor coordination and movement as well. So we're going to talk about each of these. So I wanted to talk first about the midbrain structures. And these are newer areas of research in the brain, and it's deep within the brain. But we have learned that both of these areas, the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, are involved in the production of dopamine and are also critical for movement. We know that in Parkinson's patients, this part of their brain is actually deteriorating. We know that they have lower levels of dopamine and that they also have difficulties with movement as well. But the other interesting thing for us in psychology is that these 2 areas are involved in mood, reward, and addiction. There's also something called this reticular formation, which actually goes through all 3 areas of the brain, the frontal and the midbrain and the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And it's responsible for our sleep-wake cycle, our alertness, and also some motor activity as well. You'll notice that many parts of the brain are involved in motor activity, but that primary motor cortex is really the main part of the brain that's involved in our motor movements. So the hindbrain is kind of referred to as our reptilian brain, and it's this back part of the brain here. The medulla is right here, and it's responsible for controlling our breathing, our blood pressure, and our heart rate. I can't speak today. And that's one of the reasons why if you have an injury to the back of your neck here, that it can be really severe. It can shut down your breathing and heart rate and kill you. The pons is right here on top of the medulla here, and it actually just connects the brain to the spinal cord. The cerebellum is really more interesting, I think, to us in psychology. So the cerebellum, and it's always easily identifiable when we look at a real brain. It's this huge area right here, and it's actually responsible for muscle coordination and balance. It also stores our procedural memories. So if you remember the case of HM, he had his hippocampus removed, but he was still able to remember procedural memories. So he remembered how to type, he remembered how to ride a bike, he remembered all the things that he was able to do before, and then he was even able to learn new procedural memories, hands-on activities, new ways of doing things. He didn't have any short-term memory, but he still had his cerebellum intact, so he was still able to make new procedural memories. The cerebellum is also, it's involved in motor coordination and movement, and so musicians have been shown to have a larger cerebellum. So, are musicians born with a larger cerebellum, or is it larger because they've used that cerebellum more for their musical abilities? Probably the latter. And that is it on the different brain structures.